Welcome back, folks, to episode 8 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills and Self-Improvement Project podcast with your host, me, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, and also licensed professional counselor and adjunct professor at a local community college. And I'd like to tell you good evening, and we're going to do some talking today about things that are hinging upon the first few episodes that we've talked about, and that's going to be peering through the mask of the marketplace. We're going to touch upon what I mentioned earlier in the first 5 episodes of seeing through the veneer of social interaction. Now that sounds like a big fancy term, and it really isn't anything that I would say in and of itself is complex, but there's a profundity there that we will be cutting through. We're going to be cutting through the crap, so to speak, because much of what occurs whenever we're interacting with people on the social level, and this isn't a deeply dark, evil thing, but there are things along those lines that do occur when we're interacting with people that can become rather painful to us, that have maybe caused us trauma, dissent, disgust, distress, upset, anger, hurt, betrayal, these sorts of things. So within what we would call our interactions on the normal day-to-day, in quotes, I'm flexing my air quotes, you can't see them, but I'm doing them, at the social level. This is where many times whenever we're speaking with people, the words that we speak being one of the 3 vehicles we discussed: body language, tonals, and the code, the words themselves that create influence in our lives, but also create change and impact at times. And often, when we discuss dysfunction, deteriorating communications, this sort of thing, we often have an emotional load, anger, upset, with intentions of creating change or controlling another individual, or maybe somebody trying to control us. Maybe we've tried to control someone else, because this is how we grew up, this is what we saw, this is what we learned. So these aren't inherently evil or bad things, but rather things that we need to have an understanding of if we're going to develop tools and skills to get a better life, a more together life, in the sense that I don't get entangled in things that today I can look back and say, wow, I've got some hang-ups there, so that way moving forward I don't develop new ones. But in a greater sense, I don't visit these upon, for instance, my children. Once I know better, doesn't mean you can't fix what's going on before, but definitely this is not a guilt and shame, look at what you've done wrong up until now thing, if you're not aware of this, but rather this is something that we can move forward and do better with, and develop skill not only in communication with our peers and family members and our loved ones, but with our kiddos in particular, because we can teach them how to communicate well and better, and we can learn over time how to become better communicators too. This isn't blaming or implicating you as being a bad parent if you are a parent out there. We all have those days. I am a parent and I've had those days as well, and there are times things can become very challenging. But whenever we see the level that we're interacting with, we'll understand not only how closely tied we are to our little ones in their development when they're growing up, whenever they're 2 years old, 3 years old, this sort of thing, into junior high and high school, but on into adulthood, that there are certain boundaries and limitations that we as parents must set, that we have to have there to keep kiddos safe. And often when kids are acting up, they're trying to look for the pushback from the parents, in the sense that we say, nope, you can't do that, because if they're not given boundaries and guidelines, they'll run amok. And often there's much tragedy that occurs as a result of very permissive parenting versus the other extreme, being so controlling that the kids can get hurt as a result of getting away from something that could be totally domineering and absolutely controlling, which is equally unhealthy. But as far as we're speaking from the average or from the middle point, what is seeing through the veneer of social interaction? What is it that we're looking at whenever we're seeing the mask of the polis or the mask of the marketplace. This is not necessarily us being fake per se. Some tend to harshly judge this as intentionally obfuscating self and putting on a mask and acting as if we're something more or better. Now, people do this, yes, it does occur, but generally speaking, we all have this. Whenever we go to the grocery store, go and get gas at the local fuel-up station, what do? We're polite, we smile, and we do what's called common courtesy. And that's okay. That's not being fake. That is just a general courtesy that we apply to people. This is not kissing somebody's butt that I've heard it interpreted as. Of course, these folks that had that opinion weren't particularly socialized. I'm not going to call you out today, but I am making a little fun. But whenever we have common courtesy, we tend to have common courtesy shared back with us or reflected back at us as well. And this is what is called, in the healthiest sense, getting along to get along. We're feeding into the system in the sense that we're investing with our courtesy in another person, even if they're a stranger, and allowing them to receive that without any sense of them paying it back, so to speak. But at the very least, we're not leading forward in an ugly way because we understand how to communicate and influence good communication. This isn't anything new or profound, but what we're doing today is slowing this down to about 25% speed so we can really look at it in a sense that we can take it apart and detail it a little bit. And these dynamics are crucially important. So we're teaching this as in me, myself, and Armando today, as a critical skill to learn. So whenever we're visiting with somebody and we're using the mask of the marketplace, it's not once again done to obfuscate or lie, but rather to encourage good communication and fluidity in social situations. And that's okay. That's allowable. Now, whenever this becomes problematic is whenever we tend to believe that that's all there is and expect there to be only this. And we're actually setting ourselves up for failure if that is the case, wherever we expect people to be this way. And we may hear concerns at home, for instance, about, well, when you're out and about, for instance, you're so much nicer. You treat them so much better than you do here. And that's kind of an unfair assessment, even though it may be largely accurate. Because when we get home, we actually can, or should be able to, if our assumptions of safety are met, like in episode 6 that we're talking about, we are able to let our hair down a little bit, to feel a little more at home, to unbuckle a belt a little bit, throw our shoes off, and feel a little more at ease, and a little less structured, so to speak. So, depending, of course, on the paradigm, we may hear things like this, but that does not necessarily mean that when we go out and about that we're being insincere or that we're lying or betraying anyone of the truth of who we really are. So why is this so important? To be able to develop eyes that are sensitive to the difference. And this is for how I taught my kiddos this way. So this is for whenever we're raising our kiddos to recognize what is genuine, what is authentic. And that helps us identify what's safe, who is safe. A truism that I learned many years ago, and one that a long-distance mentor and friend of mine, by way of email, I talked to him on the phone a couple of times before he passed away, and through numbers of snail mail, actual letters written over a period of about 6 or 8 years. Dr. Glenn Morris, someone who had written some awesome books for me that are martial arts books, but a mentor in life, so to speak, by way of his writings. And he mentioned, pay attention to children and animals. In this sense, whenever you have visitors, if kiddos and animals tend to hang around a good bit and tend to be gravitating towards someone, generally speaking, that is a good guideline that can tell you whether or not a certain person is up to snuff, so to speak, or are safe to be around. If kiddos and animals don't like to be around certain people, they're still unsocialized enough, kiddos, and animals are close enough to their most base nature that they're aware of a vibe, so to speak, or intentions. And this isn't getting woo, but rather these are things that you can actually calibrate and develop your own catalog if you haven't already. And if you have seen this, then good for you. If you haven't, then pay attention, because it's pretty darned educational. But I've seen this with my kiddos, and I've seen this with animals at the house that we were raising, dogs, cats, this sort of thing. And it seemed to be not only a truism, but a rather effective measure of who was, I guess, a sincere or good character, so to speak. And it was just a guideline, important things. Not so different with ourselves. We learn to calibrate. The term calibration is not along the lines of, for instance, racial profiling in a negative sense, but racial profiling is part of calibration. It is not a negative, because if, for instance, we have a criminal going to a Walmart stealing and happens to be one Hispanic, one black man, and one Caucasian, and they're wearing different kinds of clothes, how do we tell the police who to look for? Well, that's not a racist thing. What is it? It's a calibration of differential of who these people were, what they look like, and it's a guideline. So when we're calibrating, we're differentiating details, how people act, how animals act around a certain person, and should I be careful? We'd mention external environmental suggestions and stress. We take in information from our environment, and we have to be able to interpret that quickly in many cases, but whenever things are low-key, little things like that are just indicators that just get our antennae up, so to speak, so that we can be extra safe. And that improves our assumption of safety once we reach that, or determines whether or not if it's really met or not. So therefore, we stay on guard a little bit. Doesn't have to be an unnecessary tension, but rather just an awareness. Not paying attention because our attention is always on, but rather just becoming a little more acutely aware. And that helps us become a little more fluid, a little more flexible in response in our environment. But also, if anything does go down, we're more apt to be a better survivor in that sense. And yes, I am using the survival term. Not everything is life or death, but it's always not so far. It's always within a hair's breadth, hanging there. Not anything to be anxious about, but to be prepared for. And we'll discuss resilience as we go forward. But the mask of the marketplace, once again, is not a bad thing. So how do I see through the veneer of social interaction? Well, two things. Number one, identifying how we see versus looking at something. So when I'm looking at something, generally speaking, I'm not particularly engaged, and I see things at the surface level, and I take them, like when someone's being commonly courteous, as what they seem at surface level. Not a whole lot of engagement, no big whoop. That's just technically what it is. It is what it looks like. That is what most people do, assuming there's never been any kind of hurt or trauma or unexpected event that could have caused them harm, or anything that would have been witnessed that was frightening to them. Chances are we're looking at things in a very naive and rather accepting way. And no alarm bells going off, and we would be at a low level of condition preparedness, so to speak. So the difference between that, number one, looking, versus seeing, that's number two. And the difference in seeing has to do with not judging the social cues, the smiling, the frowning, the behaviors, the bravado when people start acting bigger than what they are, or maybe trying to do the salesman speak and try to encourage you. And part of this seeing involves us listening to the sound of what is being said, body language and tonals once again, more so than what is being said, because if they're trying to sell you the lemon car with 3 wheels I told you about once already, then you'll realize that you'll save gas because it has no engine. That's part of the story. But also we may look at the salesperson with a bit of question. Well, what's he doing? Or he's up to something. This sort of thing. And that just means that our alarm bells are going off a little bit. Doesn't mean that we're in full tilt alarm reaction. But it does mean we're just a little more sensitive and aware, and that's okay. That'll come and go. But being able to see and to see deeply requires that we be able to engage the fullest aspect of our visual capacity, our eyes. And if you're looking at something clearly and forward and right in front of you, you're looking at your individuals or people going back and forth, and you see color and you see depth and you see fibers on a dress or a shirt, and you see the fabric difference, and you see where the skin starts and where the collar begins. You see that they may be wearing a watch and that it's gold and it's not a Rolex, but it looks really nice, and they have hair and this person does not. What I'm doing is a slower process. That's a prefrontal cortex process that's thinking, naming, labeling, and making sense of my world. That has to do with our foveal vision. That's our central vision. And that part has to do with depth and color perception, recognition, and also labeling and naming, in the sense that that's tied into that part of our brain that's a little slower. It comes online at 1.2 seconds once we take the signal in, visual signal, and interpret it, and then it's like, oh, it's this, it's that, and they're wearing blue, and they've got green on their shoes, this sort of thing. That's making sense of it. So at 1.2 seconds, these processes start to occur. But whenever we're seeing true sight, we're taking in all information, and we're not getting hung up on the depth perception, but we're actually engaged and able to see not only how this person looks, but how they plug into the rest of the environment, all the way out to our peripherals and maybe beyond our shoulders to about 190 degrees. And this is our conscious known world that we're taking in. And we're not hyper-focusing on the individual and the colors and the watch, but rather seeing them as part of the whole tapestry of the vision or the panoramic view that we have in front of us that's unfolding and moving as a whole. There may be bits and pieces, but those are bits and pieces of a bigger picture. So this is non-foveal vision. This is panoramic view. It's using your peripheral vision without hard focusing forward only, or just paying attention to the peripheral vision only, but rather the whole picture. And this is looking at things with what Native Americans would call soft eyes, and in certain traditions of martial art are known as seeing naturally or seeing deeply. But seeing is different than looking, in that we take things that are non-surfacial and looking at them as part of a bigger whole versus being separate bits and pieces and parts, which we would do with our central vision. So why is this important? Part one, looking. Part two, seeing, or more correctly, seeing deeply with soft eyes. Well, this actually helps us learn another tool. This is part three. That is an emotional disengagement. Whenever we see things in the larger sense, we are no longer responding to the emotional cues. We may see them, but they seem almost kind of creepy, in the sense that someone is maybe doing things and with their hands and maybe making the facial body language that otherwise, if you were paying attention and trying to name it, you might have an emotional response to it. But this actually helps you disengage some of that sensitivity, and you see more so what's going on, and you're not feeding them the response, the social response that they're seeking if they're trying to do this. And why is this so important? Well, it helps give us a little space, a little distance away from that reactivity, but also gives us a chance to really think about what somebody's saying without necessarily responding emotionally first, because we feel first before we think. But this allows our thinker to catch up with what they're doing without having to run through the filter of the feelings that I may be getting as a result of seeing this person acting out. And they may be acting in a sense of getting some sort of attention, social attention. This is also social capital, in the sense that some people like people paying attention or looking at them. Sometimes we have a class clown. Sometimes we have the beauty queen. Sometimes we have the person that gets aroused and angry and has to show intimidation, called bravado, but no intent of harming. And if we give them the response they want, then they've won. But also that's taken some more energy away and attention, but also imprinted a bit of a memory that may be uncomfortable to me, especially if I don't want to do that. This is something that gives you a larger measure of control over yourself, but also gives you a chance to pause. And as far as kiddos go, whenever our kiddos act up, you see where the manipulation starts. But if you show our kiddos to respond naturally and not necessarily have to respond to everything emotionally, we will give you an example. Whenever we go and talk to somebody and someone tells us something that sounds particularly heinous or tragic, and they wait with this inflected, almost receptive look, disappointed if you don't respond, or waiting for you to give the appropriate, "Oh my God, that's terrible. Oh no, that's horrible" response. But if there's not enough emotion, they may even get a little perturbed at you because you might have sounded insincere, or you didn't sound like you were emotionally perturbed enough. This is where things sound a little contrived, and where things may seem a little fake, and we may overdo it a little bit just to get along, and to maintain that acceptance, or to maintain that relationship. And what I'm talking to you about is much deeper, because often in those relationships where there's expectation of emotional load and expectation of response, that socialized response, often this is where we get entangled, and it's hard to disentangle ourselves whenever we most need to be authentic and genuine and minimize the amount of social load that we give ourselves to work through. So how is this helpful with the things that have happened to me in the past? This is a very self-directed question. How can I use this to improve the things that have made me sensitive based on what's happened to me? One thing is that if you have memories, if you're pulling them up, I want you to remember this part. You're in control. If you've ever had an anxiety or panic attack, or if you've had a traumatic reactive response, wherever something in the environment has triggered that response, and your body takes off into protective mode, heart rate up, breathing change, the anxiety, panic feelings coming, then you have to recognize that you're going to be in for a ride. 10 or 15 minutes, it'll be over. It's going to be uncomfortable as all heck. But when you call this up, same memory, but no trigger, but you're calling it. It may not be the most pleasant, and you may not like it, but you're in control of it, and it's not going to be out of control. So in essence, whenever we have something like a memory pop up, one of the first things we can do is step back. Another thing we can do is do the square breath or the 4-count breath, if that comes up, to help mitigate the symptoms. Once they start early, the better the response as far as using the breathing. But the visual part, whenever we have the memory come up, often we will go into a shelled up position and we're looking forward, and we start moving towards hyper-focusing and tunnel vision. So one of the things that you can gain for things like uncomfortable events and memories where you get stressed or have anxiety is to expand your vision by not looking left and right necessarily, but rather paying attention to your corners. Listening, yes, and it's okay to look left and right. It's okay to turn left and right. You want to be able to move. You don't want your head to get stuck to where you can't look, but turning and seeing your environment, that is not being paranoid. That is where you notice if your peripheral vision is starting to narrow, that your heart rate's gone up, and you need to move probably if you can, and if not, being able to pay attention to the walls to the left and right, and to the wall in front of you, or out to the horizon in front of you without focusing on either, but trying to see it all. This is a perceptual expansion technique that works really well when the poop is hitting the fan, so to speak, or it's about to. This is a good exercise to work on with your kiddos, where you can sit down with them and teach them to touch things and play catch without looking at the ball, not keep your eyes hard focused on the ball, but rather throw the ball, and then have them catch the ball without necessarily hearing the adage that we usually tell our baseball players, keep your eye on the ball. You don't want to do that. That encourages hard focusing, which also discourages really good reactions. When we have our peripheral vision nice and comfy, we're able to perambulate. We can walk on ground without necessarily having to look down where we're placing our feet. When we hard focus, we have to look down because it feels like we're falling over. Our proprioceptive system in our body keeps us balanced. Whenever you're peripherally visually oriented and you're seeing wide, you can stand on one leg much more easily. You can pick things up without looking down and looking at them, and you can reach out and touch those things. If you play catch with your kiddos, play catch without looking at them, but be looking to the side a little bit, but being able to use your peripheral vision. This trains you to feel and remember what it's like to have your eyes focusing wide versus just focused hard in the front. And this is really fun with kiddos because you realize their hand-eye coordination goes up really fast. But also when we're experiencing this consolidates our torso. It makes us more coordinated. It enhances our proprioceptive qualities. So just some important stuff. So seeing through the veneer, social interaction. Now here's the part that I'm going to ask the value-added question. Why is this so important? Well, one is that is often where the hurts come up because we have a socially expected response. And often we're expected to be hurt or expected to hurt because we hear things, because we value what somebody's saying. But yet, if you can see where they're coming from and realize that they're really trying just to create influence, it kind of separates the person from their intention. And it gives us room to have a little compassion for them. It gives us room to have some understanding and realize, why are they pushing so hard to influence? They may be lacking something. They may need validation. We don't know. This isn't a psychic process, but it makes it very sympathetic to the feelings that an individual may be exhibiting by way of their behaviors or tones and what they're trying to accomplish in the communication. It also gives us room to understand that we don't necessarily have to play along if it's not in our best interest, or you can at least graciously listen and pull your vision back and pay attention and just hear what they're saying without buying into the facial body language. One last technique. If you're going to speak to somebody, don't look directly into the pupils of their eyes, because our eyes are very sensitive and we very much will mirror the emotions they give us if we're looking into the little dark spots in their eyes, in their pupils. If you look at what's called the glabella, that's that space between your eyebrows. If you have a unibrow, right in the middle of it, slightly above your nose, I'm saying that for the men, ladies, that is called the glabella. If you not hard focus there, but just kind of look in that area, it will give someone the feel of you're being sincere and looking at them, and you are. But what you're doing is guarding against them pacing you or guiding you into an emotional situation that you don't want to have, especially if it's something uncomfortable or particularly negative. This is something that helps us minimize getting further triggered, especially if somebody's expecting us to respond, and especially someone trying to manipulate us or push our buttons. This is one of the best ways to keep your buttons away from somebody that likes to push them. Once again, the space between the eyebrows, by looking there, it looks like you're looking at them without seeming like you're not attentive. And you don't have to look at somebody to be attentive. That is more a cultural thing, an expectation. But if you look at them there a little bit and then look away like you would normally, no one can tell the difference. But it actually safeguards you against getting emotionally hijacked and behaviorally hijacked in a situation that could be uncomfortable. Now, that was a lot in a little bit, and I packed a whole lot of technique and information into this on purpose. Now, the veneer of social interaction, we will revisit this because it's a very deep topic, but it's one that we have a lot of functional, useful stuff within. And I just want to tell each one of y'all, pay attention to what your kiddos do. Watch them, how they interact. When they're most natural is where we learn the biggest skills. Also, by teaching them when they're little how to respond appropriately and how to pay attention to those skills, they learn it young, and it becomes very useful to them when they get older and keeps them from socially engaging with things and learning when and how to engage and to be able to have that choice. And that will minimize a lot of hurt moving forward when they get into those teen years. And it's kind of a Jedi advantage. And if you tell them that, they might like it. And that's what I told my kiddos. And guess what? They liked it. And they still use it. So what I'm going to tell you now is that I appreciate you sharing some time with me tonight. And this was just a really pertinent topic, and I will revisit once again on the veneer of social interaction, the importance of it. This is an incomplete idea that we will complete more fully as we go along. And I want to tell you that I have really enjoyed discussing some of these topics up until now, and I look forward to discussing more with you. And of course, I left the runningmangetskills@gmail email if you have any comments to send me on the notes on the podcast. So if you can, like, subscribe, follow, and share. I like the share part, but if you share it, I will certainly appreciate it. So for now, have a good evening, take care, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.